Right, hello again, year eight. So welcome to lesson three on the French Revolution. Um, so what we're going to be looking at today is what caused the French Revolution to begin in 1789. Okay, last lesson, we were looking at the idea of why many people were unhappy with how unequal France was. Today's lesson kind of builds on that, but then looks at what specific events also contributed towards the French Revolution actually happening in 1789, which is when most historians date it as starting from. Okay, what I'd like you to make sure you've got on your paper or with your books in front of you now, okay, is just to make sure you've got today's title down, which is what caused the French Revolution, and then our key word for today, which is the Estates General, okay? And again, pause the video here if you don't have those things down already. Okay, so going back to this. The Estates General then, okay, was a great meeting of representatives of the first, second, and third estates. It was needed to agree new taxes, okay. Now, the Estates General was basically like a parliament, okay. It's the same idea as a parliament in French society. But the point was that before the French Revolution, parliaments would only meet very, very rarely, okay. The Estates General would not meet very often, and it only really met to agree new taxes. That was its main power, okay. Now, remember, the whole point is, though, that this parliament was not fully democratic, okay? You had representatives from the first, second, and third estates. Now, remember, going back to our little infographic from last lesson, we saw the first estate was basically the church, the rulers of the church in France. The second estate were the aristocracy, so the big landowners. And then finally, the third estate were everyone else. Now, the first and second estate was only about 1.5% of the population. More than 98% of the population was made up of the third estate. What happened at the Estates General is you had the first estate, the second estate, and then people from the third estate who would meet together and they would have to agree new taxes. But the whole point was that the third estate had only had 1/3 of the power, even though they were 98% of the population, which meant they could always be outvoted by the aristocracy and the church. Yeah. Now, that Estates General was called in 1789 because the French government had got itself into major problems, particularly with money. And it's really a key triggering moment because without the Estates General meeting in 1789, the French Revolution might not have begun. But we've got to think about, before we look at what happened at the Estates General specifically, what was happening in France at that time which made a revolution much more likely. Okay, so as we saw last lesson, one of the main reasons for the French Revolution was that France was seen as an unfair society. Many people were angry that some people had much more privilege than others. Remember, privilege is special rights that you have compared to other people. But there were also other countries in Europe at the time that were unfair and unequal, that did not have a revolution. That means to explain why there was a revolution in France, we have to look at what else was happening in the country that would turn that anger into a revolution, okay? So we saw last lesson that French society was very unequal and unfair, but that on its own wouldn't have been enough to start a revolution. If that was the case, there would have been lots of countries in Europe at that time which would have also had revolutions, okay? So there are important background reasons to do with the structure of society, but there are also some short-term reasons that trigger the French Revolution happening in 1789. Okay, now I'm going to talk you through these very briefly. You're going to read about them in your main lesson activity task, so you might want to take some notes now, but you don't need to take an awful lot. Okay, now the first set of factors that triggered the revolution are what we're going to broadly call economic factors, okay, about resources, who controlled them, money, that sort of thing. Now, one big problem was the French government had got itself into a lot of debt, and one of the main causes of that was 20 years or so before the French Revolution, France had had a major war with Britain, known as the 7 Years' War, which was a kind of global war between France and Britain. It went everywhere from India to North America and Canada, the Caribbean. And the French government had lost that war, and they'd also racked up an enormous amount of debt to pay for it. So the French government was having real problems paying back the money it owed various people it had borrowed money from to fight that war. And the question was, where are they going to get the money from? Which people in France are going to be prepared to foot the bill? Another short-term reason was there were lots of bad harvests in the 2 years leading up to the meeting of the Estates General in 1789. Remember, the harvest is when you collect your food in from your crops. And the point was that in the 2 years before the French Revolution began, they'd had very cold, wet winters, so that had washed away a lot of the crops, and also the cold had made it very, very hard for anything to grow. So there were very bad harvests, so that created a lot of anger because there were a lot of impoverished people without enough food. Now, two kind of background reasons connected to that. There was also in France over the just previous 100 years, there'd been a big increase in population. Okay, the French population had nearly doubled in the course of the previous 60 years. Now, remember, the whole point about population increase is it can be really bad for standards of living, because if you've got more people, that's a lot more mouths to feed, that's a lot more people to house, to clothe. And the big population increase meant that there was a lot of poor peasants who were really struggling to get by. So you had a lot of very poor people who could be triggered into anger quite easily. Okay, and because the population had increased so much, the prices of things had also increased. Because remember, if you've got more people chasing a smaller number or the same number of goods, it's going to make those goods more expensive. So it meant that the price of things had been increasing as the population increased, and particularly the price for food. Okay, so you've got the population getting bigger, the food supply is not increasing as fast as the population is, and that is making the price of food more and more expensive. And that is really explosive in a really unequal society. If society was pretty equal, but a lot of people lived in poverty, then maybe kind of fair enough. But if you've got a society where some people are in extreme desperate poverty, essentially starving, and then some people who pay no taxes, very, very wealthy, that's obviously going to cause a lot of anger and resentment. Okay, so the population increase combined with the price increases for food in the context of a really unequal French society was an explosive combination. Okay, so these kind of economic factors were your first big ones. Now, there were also political factors, okay? Now, sometimes the political factors and the economic factors will overlap with each other, okay? Now, political factors are essentially to do with who had power in the society, okay? How it was run, how it was structured, okay? Now, one short-term cause of the French Revolution was once the government had gotten into all these debts, and by 1787, they really cannot pay off the debts they owe anymore. The first thing that the French government does, the king and his ministers, is they turn towards the next group of people who have the privilege and the money in society to help bail them out. They basically say, look, we're in a desperate situation here. We need to tax you in order to pay off these debts. So they turn to the church and then the aristocracy, the first and second estates, to say, can you bail us out? Can we tax you in order to pay off some of these debts? Now, the aristocracy and the church, though, refused to give up their tax privileges. Remember, we learnt last lesson, one of the key privileges of the first and second estate, which everyone else really resented, was that they didn't pay any tax. Okay, so even though they're the most wealthy people in French society, they did not pay taxes towards the French government. And even when King Louis came along and said, look, we're in desperate need here, they refused to give up their tax privileges because they saw it as one of their key powers. They didn't have to pay taxes towards the government. Okay, so that was a big one in terms of causing anger from most of the rest of the population. King Louis himself, and remember it's King Louis the 16th, so XVI, 10 plus 5 plus 1. King Louis the 16th, who was the king at the time, a big political factor in the French Revolution was he was seen as a weak and ineffective ruler by a lot of the population. So he was very unpopular, but he was also seen as weak. And being seen as weak is really, really bad if you're a king when things get difficult, because people aren't going to be afraid to stand up to you. Okay, so you've got Louis as a very, very weak and ineffective king. Now, another political factor which influenced the French Revolution breaking out was we saw last lesson the introduction of what were called Enlightenment ideas. Now, the Enlightenment was a movement in the 18th century that was all about trying to apply like rational principles to how you ran society. So instead of just saying, oh, society is run this way because that's the way it always has been, its tradition, it was almost trying to look at society like a scientist would and say, well, actually, is there a different way we could do things? Is there other experiments we could do to run society in a slightly fairer way? So you had great thinkers like Rousseau, who was very, very influential on the leaders of the French Revolution, who talked about the idea of a social contract between the rulers and the ruled. So he said, if the rulers want to have so much power and privilege, they have to give the rest of the population certain things in exchange for that. So the idea of a social contract, okay? The different groups in society owe things to each other, and it's not enough just to have rulers who are privileged and don't offer very much else to the rest of the population. So those Enlightenment ideas are really important, because even if you're really angry at how society is set up and you dislike the rulers, if you don't have a vision of how society can be different, you're not going to have a revolution, because you're not going to think anything better could exist. Okay, so Enlightenment ideas are really, really important. Okay, the inequality, the hardship, all of that wouldn't have mattered if people didn't have a vision of the idea of a society that was more equal and more fair than the one existed. So Enlightenment ideas are a big political factor in the French Revolution. Now, the final trigger for actually just beginning the French Revolution as well is, okay, so we saw King Louis. First thing he tries to do is he gets together the first and second estates and says, look, cough up the money. You can't be privileged anymore and not pay taxes like everyone else does. Give me the money to help bail out the government. They refuse to do that. So then Louis says, right, I'm going to have to do what I didn't want to do till now, which is call the Estates General a parliament and get all three estates together to basically agree new taxes, to sort of tell them this is how dire the situation is. You're going to have to pay some new taxes to bail the government out. Okay. Now, when the Estates General meets, though, the problem is the Third Estate, who are 98% of the population, they essentially say to Louis and his ministers, well, look, we'll bail you out. We'll give you the money you need, but only if you agree to certain changes in how society is run. Only if you give the Third Estate, most of the population, a bigger say in how the country is run. Now, King Louis blocks those demands. He says, no, I'm not going to do that. Society will stay exactly as it is, but I need this money. And as we're going to see next lesson, it's when Louis tries to block the Third Estate making those demands that really the French Revolution begins. The Third Estate says, hang on, we're not going to accept that. And as we'll see next lesson, they then form something called the National Assembly to basically try and take power away from King Louis. Okay, so Louis blocking those demands at the Estates General of the Third Estate is really, really important to the French Revolution beginning. Okay, so we've looked then at the main economic factors that led to the French Revolution in the short term, and then also some of the political factors, the groups and people who were demanding change. Now, what you're going to have to do just very quickly now, Year 8, is you've got a Word document which your teacher will upload into Teams. Okay, so you've got here 9 information cards about what caused the French Revolution. All I want you to do is to categorize them into political factors and economic factors. And again, you've got a little definition about what each one means there to help you out. Categorize them just by changing the color of the text. So I've done it here for the first two. So this first one here is an example of an economic factor. So I've shaded it in green. You can do the same thing for the other ones you think are economic factors. You've then got red for political factors. So again, this is one example of a political factor. See if you can find the other ones as well. And there might be one or two where you think that actually this one is kind of both. If that's the case, just shade in half the text green and the half the text red. Most of them belong clearly to one group or the other, but obviously political factors and economic factors can sometimes overlap. So if you're not entirely sure which is which, you can just colour them both. You can colour it in both a bit of green and red to show that you think it's sort of both. Now, once you've categorised those cards and you've read through them carefully, you've just got 7 questions you have to answer here, just based upon the information on those cards. Okay, so these are just like comprehension questions. Either complete those on the Word document or write them down on a piece of paper and then send your teacher a picture afterwards. Now, I have also put on here some challenge and extension work, which is what I normally get my students to do if we were in school, which I think is a good task, which is to write a short letter to King Louis XVI. In fact, I'll just do it on the PowerPoint here. Yeah, good. So, little extension task. You can write a letter to King Louis XVI explaining why people are angry and if a revolution is likely to happen. You're pretending you're like one of his spies who's gone around the different bars, listened to what people are saying about the government, and you're trying to explain to Louis why people are angry, and you're also trying to explain why revolution looks like it's quite likely at this point. And remember, with this one, you've got a little checklist on that Word document. I'm not going to go through it in detail. You're going to be writing it in the present tense, and you're going to try and find specific examples of what's making people angry. Try and use key terms when you can, and then think about what kind of events have also made people really angry and likely to demand revolutionary change. Okay, so once you've done, so there's 4 things you should have done today. First one is just watching this introduction video. There is then a second video for task 2, which I want you to watch, which is really going to help you to understand the events leading up to the revolution of 1789, which is a YouTube clip that I've made from a documentary. So you need to watch that as well. You've then got your cards, which you need to sort and answer your comprehension questions from. And then finally, as usual, there is an end of lesson quiz and an exit pass. So those are your 4 main tasks. You've watched this video. There's the second short 5-minute video about the build up to 1789. You've then got your comprehension questions and your card sort. And then finally, you've got your exit pass and your end of lesson quiz. Okay, so I will see you in your next lesson, Year 8, and it'll be really nice to have you all back in a week and a half's time and see you all face to face and do some face to face teaching. Where we'll carry on doing the French Revolution, and your teachers will be seeing how much you've actually managed to take in from these few weeks. Okay, so have a good lesson.